All right, listeners, Marko is up at, is it 4:20 or 5:20 in the morning, Marko?
It is 5:20. 5:20.
Okay, 4 would be uncivilized. 5 is at least in the realm of civilization, although it's still not good. Everybody admires your dedication for being here. It's nice to see you.
Well, first of all, this is the life of a strategist. It's 24 hours. You've got clients requesting a call at like 3 a.m. in the morning. It's also a life of someone who lives on the West Coast. This is how the rest of you punish us for living in on the Pacific coast. And then finally, if you want to achieve absurd levels of manliness, you do have to wake up early to bench press. And we will get to this a little bit later, I believe.
Yes, from Canadian nationalism to uber manliness. Let's just start right there. So this was sparked by an article. BBC had it, but there's a bunch of different articles around this. We're going to be talking about Father Moses McPherson, whose congregation has tripled in size in the last 18 months. He lives in Georgetown, Texas, just a little bit north of Austin, Texas, the city where Marko and I met. Also, it's funny. I didn't even tell you this, Marko. Gordon Ramsay did like a Kitchen Nightmares episode in Georgetown, Texas, and this is like I don't know, spiritual life nightmares is what this guy does. I don't know. He like goes into your house and yells at you and tells you what to do. Anyway, so this guy, Father Moses, he was a Protestant who worked as a roofer, but now he's a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, or ROKAR. I don't know if they call it that, but that's what their acronym is here. And I mean, the BBC article has just, whoever wrote this article must have had a ton of fun, because it leads off with a quote. A lot of people ask me, Father Moses, how can I increase my manliness to absurd levels? End quote. And he has a whole YouTube video as championing a form of virile, unapologetic masculinity, with which sort of confusingly, Marko, includes skinny jeans, crossing your legs, using an iron, shaping your eyebrows, and eating soup. These are all things that are too feminine. Yeah, these are like,
Yes.
yeah. So he's saying that these things are too feminine. He's gotten 75 new followers, which doesn't seem like a lot in 18 months, but whatever. Like, that's more than 0 followers. I wonder if he has a podcast. He can claim that he tripled it in size. Anyway, it literally seems like a plot. I don't know if you've seen The Righteous Gemstones on HBO.
No.
It's like like I'm watching it with my wife right now, which is about these like U.S. mega. It's about a U.S. mega church, and John Goodman is the pastor, and he's got all these silly children. One of the kids, like the youngest one of the kids, seems like a closeted gay guy, and he's assembled this like army of muscular men, and he's like teaching them how to like be with Christ, but also like literally they're training to carry the cross through the Judean desert itself, and like they have to eat nice and like lift a bunch of weights and things like that. And I turned to my wife and I was like, because she grew up in the Baptist world, and I was like, is this real? Like, do people do this? And she was like, nah, this is a joke. But it's not a joke, because here's Father Moses saying we have to increase our levels of manliness, skyward. So I'll let you cook from there, Marko, because we are going to make this serious in a second.
Yeah. So I think first of all, I am Orthodox, and I can tell. Yeah, Serbs are Orthodox, and we definitely eat soup. In fact, when I was young, my grandmother, who had herself absurd levels of manliness, just FYI, so she would like force feed me soup before the meal. It was like, if you didn't eat soup, this was like obsession of Serbian grandmothers, was to feed you soup. So I don't understand why soup in the American version of Russian Orthodoxy is not manly. But so first of all, for those of you who don't know, Christianity has many different denominations. The two main ones, before Martin Luther came along and like protested the two, were Catholic and Orthodox, roughly split along the borders, effectively, of the Byzantine Empire. And the difference between the two, and this is important because a lot of people don't understand it. Whenever I say I'm Orthodox, they're like, "Oh, you're Russian Orthodox." It's like, no, that's not how it works. In the eastern part of Europe, most countries basically have their own Orthodox religion. So think of it the way the Anglicans, for example, exist. It's much more associated with the state itself, the nation state. And so you have Armenian Orthodox, you have Bulgarian Orthodox, you have Russian Orthodox. You now have, of course, Ukrainian Orthodox, which was controversial. Serbian Orthodox, and so on and so on. Greek Orthodox, of course, also very important. You have several other denominations, and they're all essentially equal, although the Archbishop of Constantinople is still like titularly above all of them, but not really. They're pretty much all equal. So each one of these groups has its own pope. Anyways, this particular offshoot in the U.S. that's gaining a lot of followers is the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. So the diocese, I guess, would be what we would call it. It's an offshoot of the Russian church. It's not the American Orthodox Church, which I actually
Mm-hmm.
also believe exists. Anyways, long story short, because Russia's so manly, you know, um, there is, I guess, appeal um, for people to join this Russian Orthodox Church, and I thought that was really interesting because later embedded in this article um, is basically this interesting link to a website run by the, I think, Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where you can go and get a visa. You can get a visa for basically residency in Russia. That's a path to permanent residency for like-minded individuals from countries, and they list the countries, and the countries are effectively all from um, from the West. It's not like any Russia adjacent countries. It's just targeted towards the West to attract immigrants, like-minded, conservative, people who believe that manliness is, I guess, not eating soup and not wearing skinny jeans, obviously, even though one would argue perhaps that you have to achieve giga levels of manliness to pull
Mm-hmm.
off skinny jeans in 2025. Some would say that. Some would say that's how you achieve giga levels of manliness. But yeah, so like the Russian Foreign Ministry has this website and this visa program that allows you to join basically Russia and get residency. And it was in this article, I guess, because it's this whole wave that's now started. It's on YouTube. It's, I guess, in the Russian Orthodox offshoot of Russia standing as a bulwark for Western traditional values. Um, I don't know what to say about that. It seems weird.
Well, yeah, it's called a shared values visa, which is remarkable, and it's like got pictures of like a ballerina and like beautiful, beautiful scenery inside Russia. I don't see any pictures of like Siberia here, for example. It's like some beautiful like rock fixture in the middle of a lake. I think there are like a couple interesting things here. The first is like the history of the Russian Orthodox Church in general is actually extremely geopolitical, and it's really relevant to Vladimir Putin and all the things that he's done. And Vladimir Putin, you can kind of tell, is obsessed with this idea of manliness too, not just conservativeness, but manliness, like always needing to be out with his shirt off, riding the horses, like jumping in the cold water. Like he's always had to project this image of being super manly and super strong all the time. Um, and I think part of it is that for most of the 20th century, the Russian Orthodox Church was on the outs with the Russian government. The Russian Orthodox Church had really deep ties with the czars, and it was sort of the czars and the Russian Orthodox Church, like, I don't know, like governed is a little bit too strong, but they worked hand in hand to maintain Russia. But the communists wanted nothing to do with religion. I'll take a Lenin quote here out of my bag that he wrote in 1905. Quote, religion is a kind of spiritual gin in which the slaves of capital drown their human shape and their claims to any decent human life, end quote. Probably Lenin would be eating soup and in skinny jeans in Moscow right now as he's as he's blogging that.
Yes.
um, and like I don't know, when the communists first take power, there's sort of this uneasy relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church is allowed to rally Russian patriotism in World War II and the fight against Nazi Germany, but in '59, Khrushchev basically says no more. Like we are going to be a real communist, basically atheist state, and the Russian Orthodox Church sort of has to go underground. And Putin turns that around when he takes power and when he's trying to sort of rebuild a sense of Russian nationalism. He really does inject the Russian Orthodox Church with a lot more importance and gives them free reign. And sort of the same way he gave Prigozhin free reign with the mercenaries, he gave the Russian Orthodox Church free reign to go about and spread, as you sort of say, Russia's values throughout the Orthodox world. And apparently, he's trying to spread it throughout the United States too. I don't think it's going to do that much in the United States, but there was some Pew data that showed that Orthodox Christians in the United States are 64% male, which is up from 46% in 2007. So something is happening. Like men are flocking to this Orthodox Church in some meaningful way, and I guess he's articulating something. I find the description of his of Father Moses and this particularly masculine orthodoxy that he's describing pretty boring. He's like saying you can serve God by being a nun or a monk or by getting married. He says you should not use any birth control. Masturbation is pathetic and unmanly. He doesn't want his services to feel like a Taylor Swift concert. Okay. He says the look at the language of worship music. It's all emotion. That's not men. Okay, bullshit. But fine. Like it's just like very sort of normal retrograde patriarchal conservative like fluff. But I guess that's what people want. I don't know.
So there's a couple of things where we can take this, and I definitely want to take it to the visa, the value visa that Russia has, which is fascinating. I encourage everyone to go to the website. I mean, BBC
I,
does it well, which I find funny.
that was funny. To go to the website, we do not suggest that you apply for the Russian value visa, or I guess you could do whatever you want. Y'all are all
Do
adults.
whatever you want. I mean, why not? Like, it's a free market, I guess. And just the pictures that they show ballerina, the Kremlin, and also just this like picture of a family that they got from like a stock photo of just a man holding a baby, a woman holding a child, and they're holding hands running through, I guess, wheat fields in Russia. So um couple of things. First of all, I do think that men and boys are clearly lost. There's a great book by Richard Reeves called Of Boys and Men, which I would encourage everyone to read. And in fact, effectively, it argues that one of the problems is that just genetically speaking and biologically speaking, women and girls develop faster than men mentally. And so what happens in competition in education is that quite often girls are going to outperform boys. Now, in the past, the way that we didn't allow this to happen is what's the word? Discriminated against women. That's right. That was our solution. For thousands of years of human history, we basically just discriminated women. But because we don't actually do that anymore, or not to like the extent it happened in the past, what's showing up in test scores, in educational results, in job opportunities, especially in a heavy service-oriented economy, is the fact that, girls rule, as the first chapter of the book is titled. Now, Richard Reeves is not some right-wing ideologue. He's actually, I think, what is he exactly? I don't think he's just an author. Oh no, he is. He's a social scientist, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, which I have to say sounds weird. Has a PhD, I think, in geography. Interesting path to write about this. But he's not. I mean, he works for the Brookings Institution. Like he's not some weird YouTube show or a podcaster, if you will. And so his book is not some sort of call to go back in time. He's just trying to fix this issue that's coming up, and that nobody is very comfortable talking about. They're not comfortable talking about it because if you talk about boys and men falling behind, you're somehow anti-feminist. And I think one of the most interesting things that Reeves argues is that that's not the case at all. You can be a feminist and you can also just identify ways in which men and boys in today's modern society are starting to fall behind. But why do I bring this book up? I bring this book up, first of all, because it's an interesting one and I like reading different perspectives. But the other issue is that Reeves is right. And that's why there's such appeal to new forms of achieving uber manliness, in a world where boys fall behind in school, and then end up, facing law schools and medical schools where a vast majority are not women who graduate from those programs, which is fine. Like, that's all good and fine. But like the point is, there is there is something missing, and I think it's being filled increasingly by ideologies and new religious cults or new religions, and new appeals to how to become a man, new sort of ways. And I think it's an interesting point that I don't think we've all accepted as the source of the new ideological tensions in the world. I think that's something that like is not being discussed enough. In other words, we're in a post-industrial society. This appeal of bringing back manufacturing to the US, there's part of it that makes sense from a national security perspective. You should be able to build cars if you one day have to build tanks. Okay, steel, aluminum, I get it. Yeah, steel, aluminum are really important in a war. So there are ways to justify, tariffs through national security. But when you start asking for bicycles and like, you know, I don't know, like toaster ovens to be built in America, you have to step back and be like, okay, well, what is this about? And then you realize, well, it's about the fact that, for a lot of men who are not very well educated and can't really do service jobs, um, what is there to do? So I do think that this issue, this socio, biological issue that we have in our society of men and boys falling behind in 2025 is not just a silly sort of a meme. It's also underpinning a lot of the policies that are being shaped by right of center um, parties across the world.
Yeah, we talked about Israel Palestine last time, so now we're going to talk about this. We're just flirting with cancel stuff all over the place. It's funny. I think there's a lot of different things you can attribute this to, and I don't know which one it is. I feel like it's a cop out to say, oh, it's all of them, but maybe it's just all of them. But like on my list of things that could be driving this, um, there's a couple different ones. Number one is just like the sort of with the end of the Cold War and the victory of capitalism, like we can go back to Lenin and the gin of the masses and just say like, yeah, like all of this like godlessness and just consumer culture and buy and do whatever you want. Like there is like a moral center that seems to have gone away. And if you look at decades of declining religious rates, like that's in there. It could also be driven by the internet. Like people are not hanging out in person anymore. They're hanging out and playing video games. They're not. When George Kennan was writing in the 1950s about how much better the United States is than the Soviet Union, one of his key indicators was Americans hang out with each other. They go to bowling leagues. They have like natural affiliations and institutions where they do stuff together, and they're not worried about the KGB taking and arresting them and putting them in the gulag. They just want to go bowl and like do whatever they want to do. Like that has really gone away. Manufacturing and agriculture, like two of the manliest jobs out there. Even if you are making bikes, like steel and aluminum, really manly. Being in the field, doing stuff, like really manly. Doing stuff with electrician work, like yeah, all those jobs have gone away, and they've been considered bad, and they've sort of been considered low end. And as to your point, the manufacturing jobs are not even really there anymore. I wonder if the university has something to do with this. And you can see, I think, with the way that MAGA is cool with the Trump administration, literally shooting the United States in its own foot. Like, I really do think 10 years from now, when we talk about the long-term impact of the Trump administration, the attack on U.S. universities that is happening right now is going to be the biggest thing that negatively impacts the U.S. going forward. But you can feel in how the MAGA movement treats the academy that they think there is something wimpy, whether it's critical race theory or all these other things. Like there's something there. And I would tie that to the issue of manliness with, it used to be that only not the best and the brightest, that the upper crust of society went to university. Like university was finishing school for the men of the aristocracy or for the upper classes. Like people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt went to university because it was sort of, you were on the short list of somebody that could run the country. I think for better mostly, but for better and for worse, like the university has been democratized. Not only can anybody go to university, everybody should go to university. And we'll tip the scales so that no matter where you are, how intelligent you are, everybody deserves the same chance to go to university and get a liberal arts degree, even though that's not necessarily what you need. So I think that's in there. And then feminism is in there too. And women wanted to have money of their own. They wanted to have careers of their own. I always crib from Christopher Hitchens, who said, if you want the most surefire way to cure poverty in the world, empower women, give them access, like, and give them power over their own biological clock. Every single society that has done that has enriched itself massively. Going forward, which actually cuts against this idea that Russia shared values. The woman has to go back into the house and breed while the men do manly things and build things and stuff like that. There's an interesting juxtaposition there too. And then I know I'm rambling, but the last thing is just, it's also not just the Russians and the shared values. Like, this has been an obsession of Elon Musk's and sort of the rights for some time in the United States. Like, I can go back to 3-4 years ago, where Musk is talking about population collapse due to low birth rates being a much bigger risk to civilization than things like global warming or things like geopolitics. And you've got like this coterie of your Joe Rogans and your Dave Portnoys and your Chris Williamsons, all of whose podcasts I would happily appear on so that I could connect with the misguided male youth. But they're all out there, like, in this very, muscular is the wrong word. It's like a very simplistic, like a very sort of empty bro culture that a lot of people listen to because they relate to it, because they feel like it's a quote unquote safe space. So I don't know. I'm like throwing things out at the wall, trying to figure out what the why is, and we probably won't be able to do it. But
No, I think what's fascinating about this is that this is one of the things that I think is happening in the world right now on almost every issue. And what I mean by that is that there is a challenge to the conventional wisdom, and it's usually right of center. And the liberal left and the progressive mainstream ignores it and basically says it's a slippery slope towards a racist, eugenics, like Nazi fascist state. And so it refuses to discuss it. And then it's just remains in the right wing domain where it leads to a Nazi fascist state. So what do I mean? What do I mean by this? Like climate change, I think, is a very similar topic where climate change obviously is clearly happening, but is it going to cook us by next Tuesday? Are we all going to die by next Tuesday? I'm not sure that that's the case. And no, driving a Tesla doesn't make you better human being. It actually makes you stupider if you're driving a Tesla in part of the country where electricity is not derived from alternatives. So you're just a moron who's driving a piece of technology with 200 kilograms of metals that somebody had to dig out of the ground, take to China, refine, and then send it to you. So that's a good example to me of an issue. Similarly with this, and what I find fascinating with Richard Reeves's book, which I've read, by the way, I just checked up, he worked for Nick Clegg. I mean, like he was the leader of the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom, deputy prime minister. I mean, like he is not a right-wing lunatic. So for all of you who have not heard of this book of Boys and Men, no, it's not some right-wing appeal to like subjugate women. But what he does is he presents data and says, hey, look, boys are falling behind in education. There's nothing like wrong with that. Like, they just develop a little bit later than women, but we send them to school at the same time and they compete for entry exams at universities, very competitive, at 18. And they are not yet ready to compete with 51% of the humans who are developed earlier than them. So then they fall behind and then they fall through the cracks. And then they're left to be caught by the YouTubers and podcasters that you were mentioning. And apparently the Russian Orthodox Church of America, which offers them a path to uber levels of manliness. But what I find interesting and where I want to point a finger to is to the left, is to the liberals, because they're the ones that are unwilling to even debate this issue in many ways. And I actually, the way I found out about Reeves is I watched him on a couple of like comedy talk shows where he was basically being made fun of by the interviewer. Like, oh, really? Like, men are falling behind? And he's like, no, I'm actually serious about this. Like, here's this book, and they're like, ha, ha, ha. And he's like, no, but seriously, we need to talk about this. And if we don't talk about it, then the men who fall through the cracks, or the boys, are going to find ways to fulfill themselves, to be manly on YouTube. And I think this is something where Donald Trump and the MAGA movement are kind of right. It's this failure to debate, failure to recognize something as a problem that then leads to people reaching for the Russian Orthodox Church as a solution to their problems. And it's the unwillingness often of the establishment writ large to debate the issues. Similarly with climate change, mitigation of climate change. Like as somebody who lives in Los Angeles, who's basically place where I live almost burned down. I can tell you that I don't want the mayor of my city going to COP.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she needs to stay in this town and make sure that there's mitigation to climate change because it's happening. Like state officials, like Governor of California, should not be going to an international conference on climate change. Sorry, bro. Sorry. Come on my podcast. Come at me. We'll talk about it. But Governor Newsom should stay here and mitigate for what's going to happen. Like sitting there and pretending it's not happening, and that we can still mitigate it through EVs in like Bulgaria is nonsense. You need to make sure that there's enough water in like fire hydrants, for example, so that mitigation occurs. Again, a very similar problem that we have in our society where there's an issue and it just doesn't get handled because the ways to handle it actually undermines the bigger story. So this is one of those things, and I find it, fascinating that we've basically gotten to a point where, some young man has no recourse to anything else other than to listen to Joe Rogan, bench press, and join the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm here in New Orleans, ground zero for climate change. And exactly to your point, like, there have been so many plans about how to deal with living close to water. And invariably, none of the plans get made. They just build some more pumps and some construction company gets a back end deal and whatever. And I guess you were talking about the left. I want to protect some part of the left because I don't know if you saw this. Did you see that Bernie Sanders went on Andrew Schultz's podcast a couple weeks ago and was getting major flack on the left for going on there because like people accused him of being a racist and things like that. I would encourage people to go watch the episode itself. It got over 1 million views. But he did. I mean, he did what Bernie always does, which is Bernie. This is the thing I like about Bernie, even if I disagree with 60% of what comes out of his mouth. He's always the same. He's always authentic. Like he's telling you exactly what he thinks. And he basically is like, don't get me on this whole I'm a racist thing. I think that this is a class issue. And I think poor people have been taken for a ride in this country. And I think we need to deal with inequality in all these different ways. Don't distract me with all this bullshit. I was marching in the 60s and 70s. Like I'm not that guy. I hate that I'm being pigeonholed like that. But to your point, like Bernie was like kept on the outside in that 2016 election, was sort of thrown into the populist bag, pushed to the side, pushed as this person who wasn't relevant, when there is a voice on the left that is willing to sort of confront it. And there it's less about or the thing that he's really focusing on there is the establishment. And this is where the sort of Trump thing breaks down, because it's, Trump promised to drain the swamp and to get rid of the establishment, to challenge conventional views. Okay, like with you, except like the level of propping up the establishment and the grift that we're seeing out of this White House is just like absolutely shocking, and that doesn't seem to matter to people. But last point, just it was shocking at the time that Kamala Harris wouldn't go on Joe Rogan's podcast. Like
Well,
Rogan had Trump on, and like well, no, correct me then, because she didn't. My understanding was that she didn't want to go on.
No, Joe Rogan addressed this on his podcast, I think, and it was she basically said, "Look, you have to fly to us, and I'll give you an hour." And he was like, "No, the whole point of this is you have to come to my like physical location, be here for like 3 hours, and it's when this thing gets into that 2.5 hours, that's when you start losing, your composure, and that's when you say the real stuff, And I thought that was fair. On his, this is how he does it, and she has to do what he wants, but they refuse to accept those conditions. And then Trump
Okay,
was like,
well,
"All
the
right,
same thing. Like
hour."
Kamala Harris, like if he hadn't invited her, Kamala Harris should have been begging to get on that show. She should have been trying to reach all those people that were listening. And instead, by saying no, they just gave another platform to Trump and gave all those anybody who was looking to Rogan like, oh, okay, like Trump is brave enough to come on here and talk to this guy, and the other one isn't. That's like all I really need to know. And I don't want this to be a Joe Rogan love session, but I will say, like, I listen to him every once in a while, honestly, when I have trouble falling asleep, because he like gets me right to sleep. But I think he does a really good job of opening space for interesting conversation. He's not afraid of looking like an idiot and asking stupid questions, sometimes to smart people, sometimes to people I regard as absolutely batshit insane. But like he opens up a space for conversation. And I think there is like a real desire for like,
That's what I'm
oh,
getting
like
at.
you could say whatever you want, like you'll like it doesn't matter how dumb the view is, like you can learn, or that's a gateway drug into actually learning something rather than being taken by Father Moses to stop jacking
No,
off.
and
And
that's so okay. So here's some homework for our for our fans here. So first of all, go and watch Richard Reeves's interview of Boys and Men and Reframing Debates About Gender on The Daily Show. This got, I think, 267,000 views. It's on YouTube, and he's basically interviewed by Desi Liddick, who is one of the anchors of The Daily Show, rotating anchors. And effectively, like, it's a hilarious interview because this guy who worked for Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democratic Party of the United Kingdom, probably the most socially liberal party in the United Kingdom, um, wrote a book that says that boys have fallen behind. And Desi Liddick can't stop but making fun of him. You know, it's like, this is ridiculous, right? Like, but men are toxic. And he has a real problem with the term toxic masculinity, you know. And he makes a really good point, which is that we have basically decided that this is a ridiculous conversation. Anyone who has a conversation about boys falling behind is clearly a right-wing lunatic. And therefore, we're going to just let them join the Russian Orthodox Church of America and, you know, and then learn how to become men from much worse options. And that's, I think, that's where the establishment really is deaf. And how to raise boys, how to integrate men into society when the easy jobs are gone. That's a really important issue, and shouldn't be left to YouTubers and podcasters and various like Reddit threads to solve. So
well,
that
and I don't know how you feel about this. Arguably, is going to get much worse if the promise of AI is everything that people say it is. Okay, so first it came for the manufacturing jobs, but how about the lawyers and the architects and the engineers and even some of the doctors and things like that? Like,
well,
what happens when
most doctors and lawyers are now women, Jacob. So you know,
well, okay, like it's gonna come for them too. I'm just saying, like you've already got like this, like they're losing like professional avenues for accomplishment. Like what happens when? There is an anecdote. I've said this on my other podcast where some friends that I have in North Dakota, the men in like the young boys, college age, don't want to go to college. They want to go to electrician school or trade school or whatever else and just make 100 grand or 150 grand being an electrician. And they're totally happy with that, or
well,
be a
that's not.
stonemason or something like that, you
Yeah,
know?
well, that's not a bad idea. I mean, I think that that's where one of the things that President Trump said was that he wants to redirect this funding from Harvard to trade schools. So, I mean, there is an argument for that. Obviously, it doesn't have to be redirected from Harvard, but the truth is that in Germany, for example, not everybody does get to go to university. I mean, you get a chance, but if you're not good enough, quite a lot of people end up going to a 2-year program. I don't want to call it a trade school. It's not necessarily a trade school. It can be a 2-year program for hospitality. It can be a 2-year program for like an accelerated business degree. The point is there's other alternatives other than university. But what's interesting to me about all this is that um, it requires, I think, acceptance of some of the problems. For example, with climate change, it is very expensive to transition to an electric vehicle. So we need to take that into account. Putting taxes on gasoline may make sense if you are in the city. Fine, like totally got it. You may not need to go to Target with your car, like take public transportation. But if you live in a rural part of the United States of America, um, you may believe in climate change, you may want to mitigate it, but you don't have public transportation systems. So that's not the best way to mitigate this issue. For example, all I'm saying about this is that I do think there's callousness. That's what I would say. I think the left
Mhm.
and the liberal mainstream has been callous when it comes to these issues, dismisses them as nonsensical and doesn't want to discuss them. And I think this 15-minute interview between Richard Reeves and Desi Liddick is like a perfect example of that callousness. Now, God bless her, she's a comic. It's not her job to interview the man properly. But I thought that was a very, very good way to kind of think about this, and that's why this BBC article, caught my attention. That's why we spent 35 minutes, basically talking about it, because um, BBC, I mean, on one hand, really good job on shining a light on this issue. On the other hand, they are making fun of it themselves. They're saying, like, look at these idiots in Central Texas, finding appeal in Russian Orthodoxy. Like, how stupid is that? But what they're not really examining, and it's not their job, they're just journalists, but what they're not examining is why. Why do,
Mhm.
young men starting families find a need to, like, appeal to some sort of a higher power in order to feel comfortable with who they are? And that's, I think, a deeper social issue that's maybe at the crux of almost all of our increasing levels of toxic ways to achieve uber manliness, which includes toxic forms of nationalism, jingoism, trade tensions. A lot of this stuff at its root cause may be a biological reality. We have finally broken down discrimination against women, and that's awesome. Yeah, not all of it. Again, it's not perfect, but we've broken down a lot of it. But that has created this interesting consequence, which is that men and women don't develop at the same pace. And so by the time they're 18 years old, men should be behind, given the biological realities of the two of them. And I think that's fascinating. And
Yeah,
that might
and
be,
it really
yeah, sorry, a
well,
permanent gendering almost of politics, which is not a good thing. That is not, politics should not be gendered.
Well, and going back to our Russian values visa, like there's a reason that Vladimir Putin like made Ukraine like, he wanted to denazify them, but also that Ukraine was like, this source of like sexual promiscuousness, and there's, gay people running around Kiev, and they've abandoned the values of Russian Orthodoxy, and like we have to get them back into the Russian fold. Like this was part of the rhetorical cocktail that justified this and has Russian men going to fight. So that's what you're getting if you get the Russian
I
values
love the way
visa.
you put it. Put that again. What kind of cocktail?
What did I've already blacked out. What did I say? I
Well,
have to go
no, I
back and
mean,
listen to it.
it's this toxic cocktail. You're right, that definitely got used for Russia versus Ukraine. But even the tariffs, even this idea of bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., it appeals to a sort of a lost individual sitting somewhere in Oklahoma or Indianapolis or whatever, and saying to themselves like, "Hey, if only we didn't have globalization, I would be in a better spot." And first of all, that's
Yeah.
ridiculous because when we do return manufacturing to America, you're not going to be in that factory unless it's to oil the automated robot. So like you will still not have a good job, whoever you are out there. But I'm pretty sure you're not listening to Jacob Shapiro and Marko Papic. Um,
And this was actually like on Fox News, like Fox News host Jesse Waters. He did a whole segment. What was this in April? The segment was, "Could Trump's tariffs be the ultimate testosterone boost?" He's called everything from grocery shopping to eating soup in public feminine. I wonder if he's visiting with Father Moses. And
This is
says when
not
you sit,
about soup is manly, man. Like, come on. Like, it's
I know I
soup.
make a great soup. I
You're
mean, it's
outside, you're
ridiculous.
working, there's like smoke billowing out of the soup. Like this is very manly. Like you try eating a soup made by a Serbian grandmother. God.
Well,
But
and
listen,
and he said when you sit behind a screen all day, it makes you a woman. Studies have shown this. And then there was another person who came on the program that said that Trump's trade policies, to your point, will fix the crisis of masculinity stemming from the loss of manual labor jobs in America. So this is not academic. Like if you're listening to this and being like, Marco and Jacob are tired, they're searching for something to talk about. No, 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 no. This is like actually the top of the fold. Like not just in the Joe Rogan universe, in the Fox News universe, in the
yes.
mainstream like right wing universe.
But see, this is what I'm getting at. Now we can sit here and make fun of it, right? Or we can say, okay, 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 but why does it appeal? First of all, I just got to be very clear. There will be no expansion of manufacturing jobs in the United States of America. It's not going to happen. It is not going to happen. Zero chance that happens. Zero. Like, I'll fight anyone about it. And I ate soup from a Serbian grandmother, so come get me, and okay, so 5 years from now, when we look at the numbers and we see like there was a little bit of a tick up in manufacturing jobs, the point is the policy appeals to this like bringing testosterone back to America. And then, the liberal left and establishment will say, well, this is stupid. There won't be any jobs in America because Marco's right. It's automation. But we still haven't solved the fact that a bunch of dudes find this appealing. And they find it appealing because of the kind of things that Richard Reeves talks in his book. Not some right wing lunatic, centrist, liberal Democrat from the United Kingdom with a PhD in geography. You know what I mean? Like this guy is just presenting facts.
Yeah.
Um, and we don't want to talk about those facts because it somehow makes you less of a feminist or less pro women to point out that boys are falling behind in education. And this, I can't stand this. I can't stand this as an analyst because this is what I do for a living. I'm just an analyst. I analyze problems. And I hate it when certain problems are colored by politics and you're not allowed to even bring those problems up. Um, because it makes you somehow, not member of the establishment, which I obviously couldn't care less because my clients pay me a lot of money to not be part of the establishment. And
Well,
and make,
really, what we need is all these young men to come listen to the two white cousins talk to each other about these issues. And this is where you will learn the art of manliness. Should we change the tag for the podcast, like discovering the art of
oh yes,
manliness?
uber manliness comes from listening to Jacob Shapiro and Marko Papic. First of all, ranking global powers by geopolitics is pretty manly, I'm gonna say.
Of course.
And I mean, and also like, ranking the most geopolitical like sport movement moments. Like, yeah, I think we're manly. And I think it's fine to be manly, by the way. And I think
I
that's
think we're manly.
I think we're manly. Please validate my masculinity. Okay.
Well, I'll get us out of here on one personal story, or you can respond to it, which is because I'm going to go read this book that you recommended with Reeves, and I went through my list of like potential reasons for this, but it sounds like from the book that you mentioned that he's really talking about it's actually a biological, physical thing, that the way that education structures are
In
set
the
up.
beginning. The
Yeah, the
beginning is
beginning.
yes.
Okay, and then
Like why
he
do
gets into
girls
the other stuff.
why do
So
girls crush it? Like that's the idea. Like girls are crushing it, and it's because they are biologically more advanced at the early part of their life. They mature faster. Which, by the way, if you have children, when
I have
I
two daughters.
well, and I have two daughters and a son, and I remember going to my wife when my son was about 18 months old, and I said like we should get him tested. I think so, I think there's something mentally wrong with him. And she went to me and she's like, no, he's just a boy, and your first child was a girl. And so you're anchoring to her development. And I was like, oh, okay. So not wrong. Like I've lived the experience, but I've also lived, and before, sorry to
Man, no, you're good.
interject with my personal story to yours. This is very personal to me because I have witnessed in the educational system across both Quebec and California subtle ways in which young boys are being discriminated sometimes for just being like neurotic little shitheads. They're just being like in the case of my son as an example. I mean, I was in a meeting in his kindergarten. The poor kid didn't speak any French, and the kindergarten teacher, the principal, and my wife kind of ganged up on him, and in ways that were like projecting societal problems onto. Like the principal literally uttered the words, "Does he have problem respecting women?" Now this is a 5-year-old boy, you know, and everybody in the room, every woman in the room was like kind of nodding knowingly, and I was like, "No, he's a 6-year-old, he's a 5-year-old shithead. He has trouble respecting anybody." But anyways, that's I think anyone who's actually raised kids in today's world, I think can relate to some of these issues, and it's that's why it's a very interesting topic for me.
Well, and just my personal anecdote on this. Listeners may know this. I don't know if you know this, Marco. I was a proud member of the Cornell University Glee Club. I was also the Omega for 2 years in the row in the Glee Club. So that meant that I had the lowest voice in the entire Cornell University Glee Club. For 2 years, we would compete to see who had the lowest voice. That, by the way, makes me way more manly than Father Moses. I have sung the Rachmaninoff Vespers, and I can hit the low B flat, Father Moses. I bet you can't do that with all of your aversion towards soup and all of your nonsense. Anyway, Cornell University Glee Club was an all male group when I was there. And it was honestly where I learned not to be a shithead. I was exposed to like all sorts of like male diversity, and like it was okay to not only was it okay to feel things, you had to feel things in order to sing well and to be a good musician. And like unpacking all of the baggage of you're not supposed to be feeling, you're supposed to be masculine, and you're not should like the Glee Club was like where most of that stuff got rehabilitated for me, and I learned that you could be emotional and masculine at the same time. Anyway, like not to make this like a therapy session. The reason I'm bringing it up is because in the last couple of years, the Cornell University Glee Club, it's not all male. And they've stripped all references to things like brotherhood and fraternity and things like that because they wanted to make it more inclusive. And they wanted anybody who was the right voice part be able to join the Cornell University Glee Club, even though there's an all-female group too, the Cornell University Chorus and other like, um, other choirs that you can join if you want boys and girls or male and female voice parts and things like that. And I'm just saying, like maybe it's the biological thing, maybe it's consumerism, maybe it's the loss of manufacturing jobs, all these other things. I just like the fact that in my own lifetime I saw the institution that like helped me work all this shit out really no longer exists because it's not politically correct to have, hey, just dudes here, like just dudes figuring out how to be dudes and like in a really productive, like really open like way. But like that's not okay.
Yeah,
Like
I'm pretty
everything, like
sure it is a great example because I'm positive. I would bet anything I own that the Cornell Glee Club is not a source of toxic masculinity. Facts?
and cured me of some of my own like
Toxicity?
things in that direction, you
Yes,
know?
exactly. Of course. Yeah, no, that's a great example. But let's go to the visa for a second. So basically, there's a clear problem in the West that you and I have identified. Richard Reeves talks about it too. We all understand it. What to do with men, and Russia goes like, "We've got a solution. Come to Russia. You can be a man." And that got me thinking. First of all, God bless Russia. All is fair in love and war. I have no problem with their visa program. God bless you. Yes, yes, do it. In fact, if you don't feel comfortable being a man in America, go ahead, pack your bags, go to Russia. I have no problem. It's a free world, baby. And if Vladimir is welcoming you to Russia and you want to take him up, I have absolutely no problem with this. I would not impede, I would not punish, I would not do anything to people who want to do this. But I think this is brilliant. And I don't understand why the West doesn't do the same. You see, I think it's high time that we separate immigration into buckets. You can have immigration plan to bring labor into the country. Fine, like makes sense. But why not have offensive immigration policy? Like if you have a certain level of education and you're from a country that's an adversary, we want to, like a vampire, suck your educated, smart people out of the country. And so, I've jokingly proposed this in the past. Like when Russia invaded Ukraine, I would have just said, I would have opened all the consulates, all the embassies in Russia and said, hey, man, if you have a master's degree and
Mm.
above, like free green cards to America. Now, of course, there's going to be a ton of spies that like, come across the pond, obviously. But hey, so what? What does the FBI do anyways? Like, there you go, jobs program. go make sure these people are not spies. The point is, I think that when you think about the West versus Russia or versus China or versus any other adversary, I think it's a fair point to say that the quality of life is much better in the West. I mean, anyone who doesn't say that is like clearly lost their marbles. And the point is, yeah, I mean, I think that what Russia is doing is a great example of offensive immigration policy. And God bless them, they're allowed to do that. It is, like I said, all is fair in love and war. I think the US should be adopting the same policy. But here we see the ideological uniformity of the right wing. We spent the first 45 minutes effectively criticizing the ideological rigidity and uniformity of the left. The problem with the right is that it has its own ideological sacred cows, and one of them is immigrants are bad. And immigration
Yep.
itself is some sort of a tool with which the left is trying to um, reduce the white population of America. But there are ways in which immigration has in the past been used quite offensively, and I think that this would be one of the ways to do that. So I actually I support the Russian what is it? value visa. I think it's a
The
great
value
idea.
visa.
Yes, value visa, and I think that it's not just a way to anger the American establishment. I think it's a way for them to like basically suck some talent into Russia. But I don't think anyone's really going to apply it to that visa. I think it's going to be very small. I think if the reverse happened and if the West started appealing to really smart, educated Russians, I think that you would see um, a huge exodus, huge. And in fact, most of the Russians who are educated, who are just trying to work and raise families, they actually moved to places like Tbilisi in
Yep.
Georgia. They moved to Belgrade in Serbia. And it's shocking that the West is effectively treating all Russians the same. I mean, that's on some level like ethnicist, it's racist. Similarly with all Chinese, treating everyone the same. If these are your adversaries, if these are your geopolitical rivals, then absolutely it makes sense to drain them of their human capital and their talent by making an appeal to them, making it easier for them to come as international students and as professionals.
Preaching to the choir, but the U.S. is doing the exact opposite. The U.S. is basically making it impossible for advanced students from any countries to come to U.S. universities.
So
So
let's pivot to that, because I know that you're interested in that part. You
no,
tweeted
I don't think we have to pivot to that. I think we've got some other stuff to talk about. But just like it's
the
shocking to me, like
statement of
as we're
fact. Yeah.
talking about this, that like actually the Trump administration is doing the exact opposite of what you're talking about. And maybe they I think it was Rubio out there claiming that they just need to expand social media vetting before they restart student visa interviews. But they've halted student visa interviews for the entire world trying to get to US universities, as they're like trying to get funding sources away from the universities, and you're taking away that sweet international student like tuition. Like it's just going to like irrevocably change the face of US science, and it's going to open up. They're not going to go for the Russian values visa, but Japan is trying to attract more skilled labor. Japan, like they're trying to attract immigrants. Like that's how like long in the tooth the situation is. If China started doing this, like I think it would be really difficult for people not to think about being at the cutting edge there. Europe is the odds-on favorite, or to your point, Canada, like an odds-on favorite to like really profit from this. But like
Now
it's not what
listen,
the US is doing.
just to be clear, there is a lot of fraud, and there is a lot of like non-productive ways of attracting international students as well. So Canada had this problem with language programs. So basically, you can just show up in Canada, get a student visa, and like learn English in Vancouver, but you're just really partying, and eventually you stay, or like you're a quote unquote the drain on like social
Mm.
resources and so on. I get that. But there's ways to eliminate that vacuous, non-productive source and pool of international students and direct them towards the more productive. And Canada's done that. So Canada is actually cutting international student applications 10% this year. Uh, but the effort is to keep the university applications relatively stable and eliminate those, semi-fraudulent language programs. I think the
Yeah.
U.S. I think maybe we've overreacted, to this. Maybe they are just like introducing social media vetting. I don't think it's sustainable to not attract international students. I think we need to separate what's happening to Harvard from the State Department issue. And again, we'll see in 12 months, Jacob, who's right, who's wrong. Like so.
Yeah.
I'm open to being obviously wrong and this being like terrible. Um, but I'm going even beyond that. What I'm saying is that our entire immigration system can be changed, and not just of the United States of America, but also of Europe and also of Canada. And what I mean is that it can start to aggressively recruit educated and well-trained professionals. And I think it starts with a very simple point. You cannot treat everyone who's Russian as if they themselves approved and authorized and planned the invasion of Ukraine. And effectively, that's what we're doing. And it's benefiting countries like Georgia and Serbia, whereas it could be benefiting countries like Germany, which do need IT professionals desperately. And it's just a silly fact that this is one of those things where geopolitics has not been able to break through very parochial domestic politics.
Yeah. Um, I think that maybe government they should take a look at what the NBA does, like aggressively recruiting talent throughout the entire world, get the best players into the National Basketball Association, and so the NBA becomes the best because you find Giannis and you find Victor Wembanyama. Like, why shouldn't you just do that with immigration in general? Um, I feel like, was it not Germany? I thought it was the EU. Yeah, I mean, the EU actually a couple weeks ago like launched a new initiative to try and attract scientists and researchers to the block, and I can't find it off the tip of. I'll have to see if I'm just imagining it, but I thought it was Germany or some European country was like basically offering Russian like academics like access to the
Okay.
country if they needed it like after the
Well, there you
fact,
go.
but I can't find it exactly. Okay, we did an hour on the art of manliness. That's great. Do you want to talk about Bitcoin and crypto, or do you want to talk about the big beautiful bill first?
I think big beautiful bill. Elon Musk was basically interviewed criticizing it. He was, of course, the head of Doge, which was supposed to improve government efficiency, and he was surprised that the bill increases the deficit rather than decreases it. Which I don't know what planet he was on, not Mars, because his starship blew up, so we know it wasn't Mars.
He was wearing an Occupy Mars shirt, to which I say, Elon, what are you waiting for? Please go. But sorry.
It was just such a hilarious, like, oh my god, this increases the deficit. Of course it does. And it always was going to. Um, I actually am going to take a hot take here, which is not a popular one. Whether you're a conservative or a liberal, um, I don't think it really increases the deficit by that much. You know, this is not to say that the U.S. deficit is not very large. It's between 7 and 8%, and it's going to be for the next 10 years, which is insane. And it's insane not because having an 8% deficit is a bad thing, but because there are moments when you need to expand your deficits to offset the loss of private sector, um, economic activity, such as in a recession. So when a recession happens, you should be in a deficit. There's nothing bad with that. You have to go into a deficit to offset and get the economy back on track. And when you are at 8% deficit with no recession, that's a really bad place to be. It means that you don't have any room to stimulate if a recession happens. And I just want to spend a little bit of time here. A lot of my clients, very sophisticated investors, but also just like regular people, or Twitterati, if you will. A
Mm.
lot of people expect there to be some sort of a calamity. There's going to be a giant bond market riot because the deficits are large. Um, America is basically going to default. It doesn't have to actually happen. It can just be a slow burn. You don't have to have a heart attack. You can just basically slowly die over a period of 10 years. Why? Because interest rates are going to remain very elevated for the private sector, which includes both corporates. It also means you trying to buy a home with a mortgage. You're going to have to lock in at a much higher rate. And the reason for this is very simple. When the government has a lot of debt and it has to constantly refinance that debt in the markets, imagine it's like a government having a credit card. And that credit card is constantly carrying like a $50,000, bill over and over every month. The interest rate on that is going to be very high, and there's not going to be a lot of demand in the economy for non-government debt. So whatever interest rate is applied to government debt, the private sector always has to pay a higher interest rate. And the difference between the government and the private sector is the government can print money and can raise taxes whenever it wants. Like the government can get revenue whenever it wants by just taxing you more. So it will always have a lower rate of interest. It will always cost it less than just private individuals. And because of this, the government will get refinanced at 4.5% on its 10-year debt. But that means that your 30-year mortgage is going to have to be 6 or 7%. It's not going to come down. And I think that this is something that will, over the next 12 months, become the political issue in the United States of America. People will begin to associate, they will start to understand the math because enough people, especially millennials who are now pretty old, like, I'm a millennial, I'm 43 years old. millennials are going to start being like, wait a minute, why don't I own a home at 45, 43, 40, 39? The interest rates are too high, but I saved all this money in all this crypto. you know, I made all this money with Bitcoin. Like, I can afford a down payment, but I just don't want to lock myself in with a interest rate of 7%. And it's that connection between the rate of interest, the cost of financing, and the government debt. So cost of financing for individuals and corporates and government debt. I think that connection is going to start being made. And I think that what I would say, my hot take here is that yes, this big beautiful bill does add to the budget deficit. Although if you actually take tariff revenues, assuming that the 10% tariff remains, it's actually pretty flat, to be honest. So if I hear a bunch of liberals coming out like, a couple of months from now saying that President Trump's big beautiful bill added to the deficit, you know what? Like, do some math. Look at what Joe Biden did. Look at what Trump and Nancy Pelosi did together as a loving couple running the country in 2020. Like, this is not this bill is the least profligate bill of anything that was passed by the United States of America over the last 7 years. So like, relax. So no, this is not the issue. The issue
I'm
is
fine with that. Just to be clear, that's not saying that much, that this is the least profligate bill of the last
I know.
7 years.
I know. No. But exactly. But this is a truly a bipartisan effort to fuck up American finances. That's the point. It's been a bipartisan. Like, if you want to find some bipartisanship, there you go. It's the budget deficit. It's beautiful. Like, it's a source of love between the two parties. But what I'm getting at is that my hot take, Jacob, is that this is it. This is the last one. Because from here on out, the politics are going to pivot. And actually, the politics already pivoted in January, which is why this bill is adding $2 trillion to the deficit, and perhaps not even if
2
we
trillion. I thought, where are you getting 2 trillion? I've seen 3.8 is the number that I've seen people settle on. Where's your math?
2.3 trillion from CBO.
From CBO. I thought it was
But
3.8.
well, between 2.5 and 3.5. It's fine. The point
Okay.
is it's over 10 years, just to be clear. So nowhere close to the kind of spending that we did during COVID. And the second issue is that doesn't count the tariff revenue, which is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 trillion, assuming a 10% across the board tariff, not assuming all the nonsense that was done on April 2nd. So this bill is either flat and doesn't add to the deficit, or it adds 1 trillion over 10 years, which is a joke given the current size of the deficit. The whole point of this, the whole point is that that's the peak. And I think that politics is going to start moving the other direction. Again, it already did. I think that this bill was supposed to be 5 to 7 trillion, but they actually found cuts to add to it, which was not something that was expected in 2024. In 2024, one of the reasons that the dollar rallied, and one of the reasons that everybody thought that Trump would bring growth, was that he would simply repeat what he did in 2017. But the macro conditions are not there for that. And so the bond market rioted in November and December of last year and forced the House of Representatives to basically add cuts to this bill. And by the way, just one last point, just to show the difference in the political context. In 2017, when the Republicans passed the original tax cuts that we're now extending, it was passed without any cuts. It was completely and utterly just unfunded. This one, they actually found a lot of cuts, and they actually introduced them. And so that's why the bill is not 5 to 7 trillion over the next 10 years. It's 2 to 3 trillion.
Yeah, it's funny. As you were talking, I was trying to find the CBO, and I've got two different CBOs. One estimate is 2.3 trillion, one is 3.8 trillion. So I guess it's somewhere between 2.3 and 3.8 trillion is the estimate of what it's going to add to the deficit. And we'll see what happens with the Senate. I mean, it's not just like, we can talk about the spending issue too. I mean, there's some hot button stuff in here, like the changes to Medicaid are going to theoretically save $625 billion, but are estimated to push almost 8 million Americans off of healthcare coverage. And if you start messing with people's healthcare, I feel like the politics is going to change around that. There's also like I had never, maybe I'm just a new bio with this. I had never heard of salt taxes. And now the idea that there's like this huge increased cap on state and local tax deductions, like funny there, and all the green energy stuff. I mean, I don't know, that again seems just like shooting ourselves in the foot. Also glad I went ahead and put solar on my house last year rather than waiting until this year. But I don't know. I mean, if I was going to take the opposite side, well, I guess I can't take the opposite side because you're saying that you think this is going to get passed and that just makes the problem worse. You just don't think that there's going to be any more gravy after this one, that this is the last one. Is that the right characterization of what you're saying?
Yeah, basically, this is it. A budget deficit around 7 to 8% over the course of the next 10 years is unsustainable because we will have a recession at some point, you assume, and that will require the deficit to go even higher. And also, the bond market is basically saying, look, we're not going to riot. There's not going to be some sort of a calamity where bond yields go through the roof, but we will just stay at a very high level. So you're not going to have a heart attack, but you're extremely unfit and can't climb stairs.
And how do you think that's going to change U.S. politics? Like,
Well,
the
because
the hard thing for me to imagine is that you're going to get a real impetus towards fiscal, like, conservatism, because like
well,
people are just used to the goodies.
well, let's talk about that. So the way it's going to happen is that we're going to be in a permanent state of high interest rates, and eventually people are going to ask why. Why are we in a permanent state of high interest rates, which constrain economic growth, consumption of durable goods, of homes? And the answer is going to be, well, because the government is crowding out private sector spending, and private sector investing. And this is, by the way, this is something we all learned at 19 years old, crowded into an amphitheater at a university when we took macroeconomics 101. This is that crowding out effect. This is why you cannot grow the economy with deficits. And so the irony, Jacob, is that fiscal conservatism will be stimulative. This is where the fiscal conservatives and the right-wing policies on economics are correct. When your deficits are persistently high, reducing them does actually lead to more growth and even more equitable growth. Like access to credit is very important if you're poor.
Mm-hmm.
You're not using credit to buy jet skis and boats, although, obviously some people are, but um, access to credit is how you get a truck, so you can have a job, so you can be a plumber. Or access to credit is how you get a home in a nice neighborhood, or it's how you send your kids to college. So access to credit is very important. It's not pernicious. It's not bad. But when the government has basically taken all the supply of, bond buying that there is no more supply for the private sector. And so that's where cutting the deficit will become stimulative. And I think that over the next, this bill basically was already surprised. It already surprised how conservative it was. And again, I know the mainstream media is not labeling it as such because liberal media wants to paint Trump as being profligate and irresponsible. And I mean, on some level, he is. But I don't think that the media is properly telling investors and also just regular listeners how much lower this deficit is, like how much less of a deficit this bill is bringing to the table than it could have if you actually listen to Trump's election platform. It was 10 to 15 trillion dollars. Extending the 2017 tax cuts alone, Jacob, is 5 trillion. Just that
Mm-hmm.
alone is 5 trillion. Just keeping our taxes the same, you and I, since we're US citizens and we live in America, just keeping our taxes the same costs 5 trillion, and yet this bill is somehow between 2 to 3 trillion additive to the deficit only. So I think that the zeitgeist has already changed. I mean, clearly it has. In 2017, the tax cuts were unfunded. Now they're partially funded. Going forward, I think this pendulum is going to swing even further towards fiscal conservatism. And the reason for that is not because government spending is bad. I hate that. It's not. Government spending is sometimes extremely good. But in this particular case, we're just running such a high deficit that it's basically preventing you, yes, you listening to this, buying a home with a reasonable mortgage rate.
Yeah, I'm not a well. I'm struggling. I get the zag that you're trying to make, um, and yes, like it's the art of the deal. He started at 10 to 15 trillion, and now it's down to 2 to 3 trillion. But it's still 2 to 3 trillion. that's being added on. So it's hard and maybe I'm guilty of anchoring to the 10 to 15 trillion, or anchoring to the liberal media. But to me, it just seems like yet another. I mean, and I'm so uncomfortable. I'm like literally squirming in my chair, being in a position to agree with Elon Musk. But here I am, like squirming in my chair, being like, okay. And I felt this way about the first Trump administration too. Like the one thing I really, really liked from the first Trump administration platform was infrastructure spending. And I feel like we got everything but the infrastructure spending. And the one thing I actually really liked about the Trump platform was, oh, maybe like a return to some like notion of fiscal like responsibility. And there's not. To me, there is no fiscal responsibility here. It's just the gravy train is going to keep going, and the idea and like that things are going to have to get really bad for the normal American citizen in order for the government to say, okay, we do have to cut back. And then it's also just it's all of the policies smushed together. So if you take what you're talking about with the one beautiful bill in a vacuum, like, okay, I can sort of get all the way there, but then you start remembering that, well, part of what they're accounting for is that tariff revenue is going to pay for some of this. And I mean, I think the tariff policy is nonsensical, and that most of these tariffs won't be here probably in 6 to 12 months. And if they are, it'll be like negative on the U.S. government. You pair all this stuff with, okay, but you're also like killing the universities. You're making it impossible for international students to come here. Immigration, migration is also sort of stalled, so you're not getting that. So maybe we're going to get labor shortages and higher labor costs, and then we're going to get labor cost inflation. What happens if we actually got something that happened in the Middle East, or that caused energy prices to go up? Or like, what if energy prices stay low for so long that American shale producers are out of the game, and then you get a sudden spike? And what are the inflation numbers going to look like there? Food prices here, they're not nearly where they were like 3-4 years ago, but they're starting to tick up. They're appreciably above where they were last year, and like trending in the wrong direction. So you start like putting all of these things together, and then you think about a United States that, to your point, has no fiscal space anymore, has done the max of what it can possibly do. And what did it get with that? It didn't get beautiful infrastructure or manufacturing capacity or innovation. It got nothing out of it. Just like, yeah, like
the 2017 tax cuts basically just stay. So a couple of things that I would say. First of all, tariffs are like taxes. They are taxes.
They are, yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a Laffer curve. Basically, if I were to tax you at 100%, Jacob, you would quit and become like a professional Glee singer. You know what I mean? Like,
I wish. God, that'd be great.
and the reason is that you don't have an incentive to work anymore at 90% taxes. Similarly, if I were to tax an import at 50%, you would just not import it. You would just stop consuming, or you would buy an American alternative. At which point you would get no revenue from tariffs. And that's why there is this like counterintuitive point. If you want to raise money from tariffs, you can't manufacture at home. Let me say it again. If you want to raise revenue from tariffs, you have to continue to participate in globalization and trade, because you're raising revenue from imports. And that's why you are right. What's going to stay is probably just that 10% across the board tariff. But the 10% across the board tariff is small enough that it will allow tariff revenue to be collected and imports to continue. The US is not going to shift that manufacturing domestically, but it will also be able to raise about 1.5 trillion. Now, some of the estimates are 2.5. I go with the least optimistic one from the Peterson Institute. I think that's the most appropriate. So 1.5 trillion will be raised. And that's where I'm saying I think this bill is actually far more conservative than people understand. It raises deficit by 2 to 3 trillion, but I'm comfortable assigning $1.5 trillion worth of revenues from tariffs, because globalization continues. Americans will continue to buy bicycles from China, no matter what national security hawk psychopaths say. And effectively, that 10% will raise $1.5 trillion. So that's the first thing I would say. That's where I think that maybe we're, well, it's funny because Trump himself calls it a big, beautiful bill. I would say it is a moderately sized and yet somehow still functional bill. Was that a phallic joke? Perhaps. It's not that big. Donald, it's not that big. But, it works. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that the Pew Research actually has a great poll that looks at the share of respondents who say that deficit reduction should be a top priority of the US government. Mm-hmm. And that Pew Research poll is fascinating because it actually hits some of the very important macroeconomic moments of US history exactly correctly. For example, after 2008, it goes from 50% of Americans think that deficit reduction is important to 70 by 2012. And that's the birth of the Tea Party. So the Tea Party was born out of this concern about the deficits, and the Tea Party got a lot of flack for a lot of things they did. But the Tea Party and Barack Obama, both of them together, and I think both of them deserve credit. The conservatives obviously always give it to the Tea Party, the liberals give it to Obama, but both of them sat down and actually reduced the US deficit from 10% to 3%, 2.5%, like just under 3%. So the US deficit shrunk from 10% in 2010 to basically by 2015, it was like, I think, under 3%. That's an extraordinary amount of deficit cutting, and it happened democratically through a legislative process. Now, it was very painful, and that pain led to voters not caring about deficit reduction. And you can actually see on the chart, the share of respondents who say the deficit reduction should be a top priority declines down to 40% by 2021. We're now in a post-pandemic world. Everybody wants infrastructure, just like Jacob does. Everyone's cool with it. And we start spending. And Donald Trump takes advantage of this decline in political support for basically prudence. He passes the tax cuts in 2017 without any offsets at all, just blows the budget deficit for the first time since the 60s in what economists would call a pro-cyclical way. First time since the 60s that America expanded its deficit outside of a recession. And then, of course, during the pandemic, both President Trump and Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, basically start outdoing one another who's going to, blow through the deficit more because it's the pandemic. And then Joe Biden, famously, when he became the president in early 2021, blows out another 2.1 trillion for no really good reason. Like that one, I think, was the most egregious act of fiscal responsibility. That February 2021, that early 2021, basically decision to just do some more helicopter drops to the American public, because why not? Even though we had a vaccine on the way, we knew it was coming, and it was pretty clear that lockdowns were not going to last anymore. The point is that this line bottomed in 2022. This support for deficit reduction bottomed at 40%. Only 40% of Americans thought in 21 that this was important. It's now back up to 60. It's back up to 60, Jacob. From 40 to 60% in 4 years. Why? Because voters are kind of not stupid, and they understand that inflation was one of the consequences of all this fiscal orgy. And the second thing that I think voters understand is this crowding out effect. They're starting to ask questions like, wait, why is this auto loan? Like, I was able to afford buy a car and have an interest rate on my auto loan at like 3%. Now it's at like 7%. Why? Why is my mortgage not 2%? Why don't we have 2% mortgages for 30 years? And the answer to all of this is the deficit. And so that's why I think, first of all, I can empirically prove to you that the directionality of this is moving towards more fiscal conservatism. But the other one is that historically, I think a lot of people are very reticent. There's this very callous and glib view that democracy always stands towards socialism and towards more spending, that voters will never vote to cut themselves their entitlement benefits. That is repeatedly throughout history proven incorrect. Argentina just elected a dude with a chainsaw, and he was carrying a chainsaw for a very symbolic reason, i.e., I'm going to cut the government. People voted for him. Margaret Thatcher did not mince words about what she was going to do. David Cameron in 2010, same thing. And similarly, again, Obama and the Tea Party got together and actually shrunk the deficit from 10 to 3%. Not because they were doing something voters didn't want. No. It was the voters that pushed them to that. And you can measure where voters are on this kind of like, profligate versus conservative line through just polling. And I'm telling you, it's moving in the other direction.
Don't you miss the days of civil cooperation between the Obamas and the Tea Party when our discourse was so civil and we were working together in order to reduce the deficit and things like that?
You
This has been a
won.
trope. This has been a trope in our podcast. You might be right about this, so I feel like I need to think about it a little bit more. But I will disagree with you until the day that I die that the voters are smart or know anything. They're morons. The Cornell University Glee Club cured me of my toxic masculinity, but not of my intellectual elitism. It's all a bunch of idiots. Um,
Well, you know what I would say? I would say that voters over the long term approximate good judgment asymptotically.
I don't know. I don't think so. And I don't think your Argentina example actually helps you that much because you literally had to get to hyperinflation and people had to get things had to get so bad in Argentina that they were literally willing to elect any crazy person who was just seen as different. Um,
Yeah,
which,
and there's a lot of examples of that, by the way. After the financial crisis in Greece, massive fiscal consolidation. Greece is now doing relatively well. Not really well, but relatively well. We talked about that recently.
Mhm.
So yes, you're right that financial crises do help. They help push in this direction. But again, it doesn't have to be a financial crisis. It can also just be a slow burn. And that's what I'm telling you. What I'm basically telling you, Jacob, is that we have a slow burn. We have a burden on the economy, which is the high interest rates, and they're not going away. And it's going to be very difficult to overcome that unless the government actually releases some of that potential by cutting its own debt burden.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that counterfactual because we're going to talk about this I think throughout the course of the rest of 6-12 months because I think you are correct that this is going to be like the Rubicon or this is going to be like the thing that is going to animate politics going forward. But I go back to what I said earlier, which is I'm with you sort of a ways there, but I think what's different about this time is that the populists have captured in large part the state. And populists are not going to cut spending. Populists have to keep on giving the goodies in order to maintain their political positions. And Trump, and we talked about Bernie earlier, also a populist. Like a lot of these folks that are in the House, these are populists. These are not people that I think are going to turn their back on this spending. They couldn't do it, even though like you had Doge and these other things wandering around trying to do that. And I think the problem is that even like let's accept the argument, like let's say okay it's only 2 trillion, it's not as conservative. Let's I don't think we're going to get a trillion and a half of tariff revenue, but okay, let's say we get the trillion and a half of tariff revenue too. Like okay, it's still like we got nothing for all of this, and we're sitting on a society that is not going to manufacture things, that is giving up a lead in innovation, that is behind on and is going to be further behind on all of these other different things. And so you're going to get governments that are going to look at this equation and be like, well, do I keep giving the goodies or do I make the hard cuts and take people off Social Security and take people off Medicare and take people off Medicaid and cut US military spending and go after the big ticket budget items in order that things are going to grow? But like to do that, like you have to rehabilitate the society and rehabilitate the economy, and we're not there yet. Like we're not laying the groundwork for that. So you'll get into this trap where like it's not going to be like it was in previous iterations because like you would need spending just to get the economy to where it can take advantage of what you're talking about. Does that make
well,
sense?
actually, there is another way to do it. And I think that populists can get us there. And it's left wing populists. And so, for everyone out there who's on the center right, all the way to the far right, be very careful with this notion that, like, oh, Trump is just going to be like Nero and burn Rome. Because what's waiting in the wings is an alternative way to cut deficits. And it's called raising taxes to the nosebleed levels, baby. You know, that's another way you can solve this issue. So we keep talking about cuts, 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 cuts. Oh, cuts to Medicare, this, that. But let's be very clear. President Trump is getting none of his priorities from the election. Like, taxes and tips are going through a couple of other things, but for the most part, he talked about expanding the deficit 10 to 15 trillion. Not literally. I mean, he didn't say those words, but when you do the math, you put all of his priorities. He's getting none of those, Jacob. The vast majority of this bill is going, you know what? It's going towards keeping the law the same. And this is what a lot of people don't understand. It costs a lot of money to keep the 2017 tax cuts. Why did they expire? Because they were not funded, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
They were not funded. And because they were not funded, the reconciliation procedure, which is used to pass the 60-seat majority in the Senate, the reconciliation procedure basically forces you to sunset that bill. And so the fact of the matter, Jacob, is that there's an easy way to significantly reduce the deficit. And it would be to just let the tax cuts of 2017 basically sunset. And I expect that the next president of the United States of America, if it's not a Republican, will effectively take us back to the tax rates of pre-2017.
Well, and I think you made the important point here, which is that there's an alternative to what you're talking about, and that it's on the left, and that it's higher
Oh, of course.
taxes, and this is
Yeah.
where I do think some of what's happening. Well, I don't know, like maybe Trump is right. Maybe he really could shoot someone in Fifth Avenue, and nobody's going to pay attention. But when you look at things like, oh, charging however much money so you can get access, or not charging money, however much Trump meme coin that you buy, you get personal access to the dinner with President Trump. You can buy club memberships for the new club that they're setting up in Washington, D.C. I think the starting membership is going to be $500,000. All the deals that the Trumps are signing in the Emirates and in the Gulf, and like, I mean, they've made billions of dollars so far on some of these like crypto initiatives. And I think we should save like crypto and Bitcoin like for a proper conversation down the road. But which is just to say, if the net result of all of this is that the rich get richer, and that you literally have like the president of the United States using the office to enrich himself, like that is eventually going to give the other side fodder for, yeah, tax the rich. How did they get that money? Like, we want some of that piece of the pie. That needs to come back into the system rather being taken out by these people who are still manufacturing in China, or who are, in their ritzy clubs, or in their, gold plated toilets and things like that. Like, I think there is a populist move waiting there. And to your point, if the auto loan rates go up enough, and then the mortgage rates go up enough, and you can't blame the Biden crime family, or you can't blame the woke people anymore for that, because it was the Trump administration that was doing all of it. Like, there is sort of a counter. Oh, okay, like let's take out the Franklin Delano Roosevelt playbook. Let's get taxes up in the 50 to 70% effective range. Let's do all of this different government spending and handouts and things like that. Like, I do think that's a door that is lurking in the background. A door
I think it
lurking.
is.
What beautiful metaphorical language for me.
I think life is about the delta. Life is about perceiving. I mean, markets certainly are. Being an investment strategist has taught me that it's not about the levels, it's about the delta. It's about a rate of change. And what I think is the most profound thing is that President Trump walked into office expecting to do what he did in 2017, blow out the deficit 5, 7, $10 trillion, funding maybe some of it through some cuts, but not really. And he's been pushed by the combined efforts of the bond market and members of the House to get that down to 2 to 3 with some tariff revenue. And that is actually a shocking rate of change towards a more conservative approach to deficits. Now, I think that over the next 5 years, that's going to include some tax increases. Yes, it's not just going to be finding cuts. You're absolutely right. There's going to be a little bit more. But right now, we can close on this. But right now, the United States of America spends more on financing that deficit than on the U.S. military. So just think, that's ultimately unsustainable, and will have to change.
That's a good place to leave it. Any parting thoughts on the NBA Finals before we get out of here?
I mean, so there's a geopolitical element to the finals. I mean, looks like it's going to be Indianapolis versus Oklahoma City. That is,
I wouldn't count out the Knicks yet. I guess we
you would
should, but
not count out the Knicks yet.
I don't know.
Interesting.
Hope springs eternal.
Okay, well, if it is Indianapolis versus OKC, though, I just thought it's funny because it's kind of like Trump country, and yet he hates the NBA, which is interesting. And yeah, I mean, like, it's kind of cool. I think, especially for Indianapolis, it's a huge, like, basketball city. I think if they make it to the finals, I think that would be kind of fun. I guess the same for OKC. I've been to OKC. I watched the game there. It is a great atmosphere. But as long as the Seattle Supersonics don't exist, I'm always going to be a little bit miffed about OKC having a team.
Yeah. I wish I could make it interesting, but it's going to be OKC. That seems pretty clear. It's probably going to be OKC for the rest of the century, unless the Spurs have something to say about it.
I think they're a great team. I think Dort is amazing. I think that his defensive prowess is really, really what sets them apart. One thing I would say though is that I feel that that team has a very high variance on how it's refereed, and I don't
Mm,
mean this in a bad way, but like, um, you know, I think that what they did to Jokic was amazing. Like Caruso was draped all over him, but every single minute, every single second of that exchange was a foul, and it just came down to whether you're going to call it or not. And so I don't think that OKC has like a recipe for long-term success because despite the fact that the SGA obviously is amazing, I just feel that at some point over the next 12 months, the referees could stop kind of treating them like a novelty. Like, oh my goodness, look at them. They beat the crap out of their opponents on the perimeter. Like the reason that Caruso can guard Jokic is because you're letting him foul him. The reason that Dort is able to shut people down on the perimeter is that quite often he is fouling the screener. He is,
yeah.
they're very handsy. Um, what's the backup point guard? Number 22. My brain just stopped, but you know, that guy like is 100% using his hands on defense. Every out of bound play now in the NBA, everyone's just like wrestling. I don't know if you've noticed that. That's
Yeah.
allowed. And so, anyways, I'm not sure how sustainable that is in the long term. I think at some point, or the NBA has these waves where they just kind of let something happen because it's novel, and they're like, oh wait, that's actually really aggressive defense. No, we're gonna start calling fouls, and then suddenly their defense isn't as good as it was in the past.
Yeah. That's a fair point. All right. We'll get you out of here. Let's go get some coffee.